Wabarakatuh. Welcome back to Breaking the Habit. So we've covered most of the bases around step 1 in the 12-step program, and today I want to touch a little bit on step 2. Step 2, particularly in the fact that we are drawing close to the halfway mark of Ramadan. And step 2 is all about reconnecting spiritually. So the words of step 2 go that we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves would restore us to sanity. So I'm going to do a little bit of a reading from the 12-step book, and then we are going to touch on a work by one of my other favorite authors, which is Imam al-Haddad, to show how the can really be a marriage of the two here, between sort of a more Western approach to spirituality and an Islamic approach to it. So when we accept that our way doesn't work, which is our addiction and what we've been doing the last 5, 10, 20 years, step 2 opens the door to a new way that does. In the first step, we admitted that our addiction was going to destroy us if we did not stop, and that we could not stop on our own. We discovered that our addiction was a problem too big for us to solve by ourselves. Without some power greater than ourselves to assist us, our situation is hopeless. In the second step, we are presented with the possibility that this power can restore us to a basic sanity and well-being. Remember, a lot of what we covered in the step 1 story was how there was impaired functioning in the brain, how there's unmanageability, how there's powerlessness, etc., etc. And so, for the most part, we can feel like we are going absolutely crazy, especially when we look at our behavior, and our behavior is irrational. There are consequences that are increasing and increasing and increasing, and we keep choosing, the behavior that reinforces these harmful consequences. So step 2 offers hope that sanity is possible, and at the same time it implies that in our addiction we were insane. Our insanity manifested in many ways. We would often put our addiction first and everything else second. We may have placed ourselves in dangerous situations or taken terrible risks. And the more we denied our addiction and its consequences, the less we were in touch with reality. To be restored to sanity is to rediscover the spiritual nature we have always had, but which was hidden by the insanity of our disease. This is like a really interesting point here, because they're speaking about spirituality as something that's innate within us. And if you think about the whole concept of someone's fitrah, right? That in Islam we believe all children are born Muslim and are born with a belief in Allah, and it's really that's what our souls incline to, right? But as a result of what we've been exposed to, what we taught, etc., etc., we veer from that innate purity, or our natural disposition, if you can call it that, right? Now, belief in a higher power can be difficult for many of us, usually because we come into recovery with faith that was damaged in some way or the other. Some of us may have had spiritual beliefs before, some not at all, right? There's this question that sometimes gets asked, how Muslim are you really if you were born into Islam or born into a Muslim family? Is it something you've actually chosen, or is it just something that was placed upon you? How do you, what is the nature or the extent of your belief as a born Muslim, rather than as someone who is coming into the fold of Islam? Right. So some of us may have had spiritual beliefs before, others not. Right. Some of us may have come from strict judgmental religious backgrounds that reinforced our fear and our shame. Many of us, if you think about, especially 20, 30 years ago, when parents weren't really very engaging, and didn't really sit with their children and discuss things the way parents do now. There's a lot more engagement with our children. More often than not, that religion was simply taught through fear, through punishment, and there was a lot of corporal punishment. And a lot of the stories you hear are, you ask someone about, did you ever get a hiding as a child? More than likely you're going to hear a madrasa story, how they got hiding at madrasa, right? Or the opposite might be true, that for certain of us, 2-3 generations back, we couldn't necessarily afford to attend madrasa, especially families that, for instance, if you think about like families that came over from India who really started out, with nothing, and so the younger or the older children in the family would, for instance, work in the family business, and start working from, back then there wasn't grades, we were talking standards, and so a child goes up to maybe standard 3 or standard 4 or even just standard 1, learns to read and write and get the basics, and then right now has to work in the shop and has to generate income to support the rest of the family and the rest of the children. So those usually with that came later on in the family had a more formal education than those who came earlier on. But with that lack of formal education on the secular side, more often than not, a similar thing was true on a religious side, right? Because now children at a young age were at work; they weren't going to madrasa, right? And so some of us come from overly strict backgrounds, others from religiously or spiritually empty backgrounds. Some of us attempted to find refuge from our addiction in our religion, and so we think that, if I just pray enough, or if I just do this thing or that thing, or ask God, then He's going to take it away from me, and so we may have prayed and prayed and prayed and made promises, and commitment after commitment to our religious practices, and then just found no relief, right? Or very little lasting relief. So we may have found momentary relief, but not lasting relief, and we find it overall unsatisfactory, right? So many of us didn't believe in God, or we were uncertain as to what spiritual beliefs we were willing to accept, if any, right? So the idea here in step 2 is that we're moving from self-reliance to, as the only way of functioning, just trusting ourselves and what we can do for our addiction as a way to feel good. Moving from that way of functioning and resisting the notion that there is a greater power, or that any power greater than ourselves could do anything for us. So we start opening ourselves to this idea that by considering forces that are clearly more powerful than we are, such as nature, society, or even our addiction, we recognize that there are greater powers. And when we recognize that our own power is limited, we can more readily acknowledge the possibility of a higher power, right? And so this is, Imam Haddad speaks later, and we'll touch on it later, but he mentions that one of the ways in gaining knowledge of Allah and certainty in Allah is to reflect in nature. You think about the world we live in and how there's this finely tuned ecosystem, and just the structure of things. You think about how magnificent mountains are, and just not just what's above ground but below ground, and then how some plants will grow out of a rock, and how if you dissect an insect, you think about like an eye that has thousands, a fly that has thousands of eyes, or mosquito and his stinger, and it's got so many little components to it, or even that there's something smaller than a mosquito that feeds off a mosquito. And this is an example that's made in the Quran, right? And so how amazing, there's a huge spiritual opening to be had if we were to reflect in something as simple as nature, not even considering humans or the role that they play, but just nature in general. Right. Right. So basically, when the challenge for many of us, right, is when talking about religion, and I'm obviously going to be referring to Allah and Islam, given that it's a DTI channel, and it's the month of Ramadan, and this is our background, and this is what we call towards, right? That there are several things that get in the way of us drawing closer to Allah. One is that a lack of knowledge, right? So we may know that we believe in Allah, but don't necessarily know anything about Allah, like what are the characteristics of Allah, what the qualities of Allah, what are Allah's names, and so our experience of Allah is really limited to what we think of Him, and Allah reinforces this idea and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because Allah says, "I am to my slave what he thinks of me," right? And so, if we think of a God as a punishing God, then we're not necessarily going to be thinking about He has the capacity to forgive and endless mercy, and that I can turn to Him no matter what my state, because we're going to start to feel things like shame. And I was actually just speaking to someone before this call, and they wanted some coaching on how to do a video, and one of the blocks that they had was that they wanted to appeal to the Muslim community, but don't necessarily see themselves as Muslim enough to make this video, right? And how true is that for so many of us, that we feel inadequate within ourselves, and it affects our spirituality, it affects our ability to reach out to others, and to reach out to Allah, right? So our relationship with Allah is hampered, not just by our lack of knowledge of Him, but also things like our shame and the way in which we see ourselves, right? So step 2 is as much about recognizing a higher power and what they can do for us, as it is us opening ourselves up to the possibility that we, as we are, flawed and defective, or broken, or however we want to describe ourselves, or however we think of ourselves, worthless, not good enough, whatever, that even us as we are, we can still rely on our higher power. That our higher power doesn't ask of us to be a certain way before they act, before they do for us what we can't do ourselves. And a beautiful example of this is simply the fact that you are here listening to this message today. Right? No matter what your background was, it doesn't matter how terrible of a thing you were doing, like, Allah took care of you up until today. You may have hit rock bottom, you may have been homeless, you may have gone for days without food, you may have done terrible things, but you are still here today. Allah took care of you, He provided for you, and He kept you alive long enough to hear this message, right? And so when we start to reflect on the fact that even just our mere existence, right, is proof enough that there is a higher power who is able to do for us. Because many of us, if you think about especially substance abuse, right, we lose the ability to function. If you doing heroin, you pass out for long periods of time. If you're on tick or on cocaine, then you're functioning in a hyperactive way. generally, especially someone on TikTok, they're not really able to, for our international audience, it's crystal meth. You're not able to maintain a job or things like that, because for the most part your appearance starts deteriorating, your level of functioning, your mental functioning, everything starts to go. But yet we're alive, and yet you've chosen to click on this link to listen to this message, right? So on some level there has always been a higher power taking care of us, whether we choose to accept it or not, right? It's just always there. The invitation here is, do you want to see that? Do you want to recognize it? Do you want to come to know this higher power, right? And so that's the invitation, right? Coming to know this higher power. So one of the tools that Patrick Carnes uses in the Gentle Path is what they call a spiritual care inventory, right? And they look at how do we function as humans, and it's generally in one of four ways. So sometimes we dependent, we want and we need help. So we see ourselves as powerless, we just need, right? Then there's counter dependence, where we need help but we resist it. Then there's independence, where we see ourselves as self-sufficient and we don't need help. And then there's interdependence, where we give and we get help from others. And that paradigm interacts with, on the spiritual side of it, generally four ways in which we experience God, right? First, as a punishing God, someone who punishes our mistakes, but does not reward or help, right? And this is a huge oversight for so many of us, because it's easy for us to look at what's gone wrong in our lives and see God as punishing, and then accumulate evidence for how He has been a punishing God, but then not to recognize His favors to us. And Surah Ar-Rahman, just that constant repetition, and which of your Lord's favors will you deny, is really a beautiful reminder for us that there are favors that Allah has granted us that we may not even take into account. Like the fact that you are sitting on Facebook or YouTube or Mixler right now means that you are using your faculty of hearing, possibly speech if you're watching the video, but more likely than not hearing. And so have we taken a moment to thank Allah for our ability to hear? Have we thought that what our higher power has granted us this continued ability to hear, so that we could hear this message, right? Ajib. So when we think of God as a punishing God, we generally don't think of Him as rewarding, and so we tend to overlook how much good is in our lives. Then we could see God as an accepting God, who accepts that we fail and cares about us anyway. Doesn't really care that we've failed, cares that we return to Him. A non-involved God, who's detached and unconcerned with our lives. And so you'll sometimes hear this, and I generally don't know how seriously to take this, but sometimes people will say, God, I know you're busy, and you'll see it like it's a dramatization in movies. God, it's me, I know you're busy, but I have a need or whatever. And so there's this idea that God may be too busy for us, or we think of, why should I, even call out? Why should I supplicate? Why should I make dua? Why should I pray? Why should I do anything? I'm just one person among 7 billion. And so, where am I in the eyes of God, right? And so we could see Him as non-involved or non-existent, right? And that's just where we usually are in addiction. We tend to fall into that trap of we think that God isn't available. There is no God available to help us, right? So I'm not here to say how you should feel and how you should think or anything like that. This exercise is simply, an opportunity for us to reflect on how do we see God? What is our relationship like with God? And I mention this because if we are saying that, look, we're treading a path, re-establishing our spirituality, and treading a path back to God, and relying on Him for assistance to return us to sanity and to do for us what we can't do for ourselves, then I find the book by Imam al-Haddad to be just really especially powerful. This particular book is called the Book of Assistance, right? A book of assistance, support and encouragement for believers as they desire to follow the way of the afterlife, right? And so the journey back to Allah. So interestingly enough, when Imam al-Haddad, and just a small bit about the author, Imam al-Haddad plays a huge role in the lives, or has played a huge role in our lives, especially as Muslims of Cape Town. Generally, we think of the father of Islam in Cape Town to be Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, right? And one of Sheikh Yusuf's teachers, who he met on his journey to Hajj, was Imam al-Haddad, and he took from him various teachings, one of which is the Ratib al-Haddad, which is the litany of supplications that Imam al-Haddad used to recite. And that litany has lived on in the Cape for close to 400 years now. So we think about what we refer to as the Khadat, right? That is a litany that Sheikh Yusuf took from Imam al-Haddad. And again, here we just have an opportunity to reflect for a moment, right, on God's presence and His magnificent design. Like, really, it's incredible to think that Imam al-Haddad, who was blind from a young age, right, was known as the reviver of Islam in his time, which was like I think it was the 12th or the 13th century, right? And he Hijri. I just need to make because the math didn't add up for a moment. Yeah, so Hijri, right? And it's 12th century Hijri. So the story goes that Imam al-Haddad is from the city of Tarim, which is in the valley of Hadramaut in Yemen, and that he didn't really leave Tarim except once when he performed Hajj. So think about that, this great saint leaves his city once in his lifetime to perform Hajj, and along the way he meets Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar is then later taken as a political prisoner and is exiled to the Cape, and becomes and starts to spread Islam amongst the prisoners and that kind of thing. And so through his efforts and the acceptance of his efforts, and really there's again Allah's hand in this, in that back then there wasn't internet, there wasn't even telephones, print media is questionable at the time. I don't really know the history of the 12th century so well, but the teachings of that Imam were brought across the oceans to our shores, to the Cape of Good Hope, and has continued to live on generation to generation to generation to generation, so much so that even now we're drawing inspiration from his works. So he, in his intro of the book, he mentions that, I want to read this out to you. I seek God's forgiveness, and I do not claim that my intentions in writing this book is confined to good religious purposes. How may I do so when I am aware of the hidden desires, egotistic passions, and worldly wishes that I harbor? Right? So this great saint, this knower of Allah, is questioning himself and his nafs. And yesterday and the previous days we spoke about the questioning of our nafs, and he quotes the same ayah that we quoted which is in Surah Yusuf, I do not claim innocence for myself. The ego is indeed an enjoiner to evil, except when my Lord shows mercy, and my Lord is indeed forgiving and merciful. So here again, we're introduced to this idea that our nafs can have power over us, except when Allah's mercy is placed upon us. So part of our journey here is not just knowing Allah, but also learning how to draw down Allah's mercy upon us. Right? There's a poet, a line of poetry that's quoted here: "Beware of your ego and trust not its mischief, because the ego is worse than 70 devils." So often we think of shaitan and we tremble a little when we think of shaitan and his whisperings and how he might mislead us. But the ego, that part of ourselves, that calls to evil, is worse than 70 devils, according to the poet. So anyway, the reason I mention this book is that this book opens with a chapter on certainty, right? And it reads that you must, beloved brother, strengthen and improve your certainty, for when certainty prevails in the heart and establishes itself therein, the unseen becomes as if it is seen. And we know that there's a hadith of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anh, who says that if the veils were lifted from my eyes and I were to see Jannah and Jahannam in front of me, it wouldn't increase my certainty one bit. Like if the unseen world was shown to him, it would make no difference in his iman, because he just believed so wholeheartedly, right? And here again, we take lesson from the Sahaba, who, when the Prophet ﷺ brought a message down, it wasn't their nature to question and ask how and figure out and think for themselves too deeply and whatever. And I'm not saying we should just follow blindly, but really their first port of call was they relied on their certainty and their faith in the message of the Prophet ﷺ, and it was sami'na wa ata'na. We hear and we obey. Right? So the author carries on to say that certainty is power and firmness and stability of faith so great that it becomes as a towering mountain which no doubts can shake and no illusions can rock it. Rather, doubts and illusions disappear completely, and when they come from outside are neither listened to by the ear nor heeded by the heart. The devil cannot approach the possessor of such certainty. He flees. And we know the story of Sayyidina Umar, who it said that when Sayyidina Umar would walk down a road, that shaitan would turn around and choose another road to walk down. Right? That he flew even from the shadow of Sayyidina Umar. Like, how powerful is that, right? And so here the author is linking that to the certainty which resided in the heart of Sayyidina Umar. Right? Certainty derives its power and excellence from many things. The first, most essential and pivotal of these is that the servant listens attentively with all his heart as well as his ears to the verses, which is the ayah of the Quran, and the hadith, which is the quotes of the Prophet ﷺ, relating to God, His majesty, His perfection, His magnitude, His grandeur, His uniqueness in creating and deciding, in ruling and compelling, and likewise to the truthfulness and perfection of the messages, the miracles that they were aided with, and the chastisements which befell those who opposed them, right? And that these are sufficient to bring about certainty is indicated by, again, the ayah in the Quran. It is not enough. Is it not enough for them that we have sent down upon you the book which is recited to them, right? And so here the author is saying, as a starting point, right? Open your hearts and your minds to what is revealed in the Quran and what has been brought down by the Prophet ﷺ, through his hadith. So this should be, our first point of call, Quran and hadith, as a way to start to familiarize ourselves with Allah and to find and establish a certainty within our heart. The second is to learn from looking at the kingdom of the heavens and the earth, and the wondrous and astounding creatures that Allah made them and teamed them with. That this brings about certainty is indicated again in the Quran. We shall show them our signs on the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth. And here, subhanAllah, Allah is saying, you know what, look outside. And because some of us might argue, okay, fine, but this whole looking outside thing, right? We don't know enough about nature, and we don't know really about the mountains or the flies or the insects, and so, like, what in fact are we reflecting on? But then Allah says, okay, fine, then reflect within yourselves. And here, so much work has been done for us. If you do a simple Google of, miracles found in the Quran, right, or scientific miracles in the Quran, that science now is catching up with information that the Quran has revealed a long, long time ago, right? And again, this is one of the reasons we see the Quran as a book of all time, because there's information that we are figuring out now that we just didn't have the technology to prove way back when. So, for instance, there's an ayah in the Quran that speaks about how the angels traverse between the heavens and the earth in the span of like a day and a night, and with that they calculated, okay, fine, what is this calculation, in terms of speed, and that given that the angels are made of light, they calculated that it's the speed of light. And if you go and Google what is the speed of light, you'll find out that it's exactly the same thing, right? So, subhanAllah, information about the speed of light was revealed like 1400 years ago, right? And then, again, this example of within ourselves, if we consider, the ayahs in the Quran where it's spoken about how we are made from a clot of blood, or a drop of semen forms into a clot of blood, and then on and on, stage by stage, this progression of our creation is described in the Quran. And again, science has come to show how the stages of the fetus develops, and so the more we choose to look within ourselves and choose again through openness, because we have to be open to it. If we're not going to be open, if we just close mind and going, okay, well, just prove it to me, prove it to me isn't searching, right? If we're open, then we're searching. There was a gentleman who attended one of the events at Mahabba one day, and he was asked to speak, just and he says that he was a revert to Islam not too long ago, and he was a Muslim maybe at that point, I don't know, a year and a half, maybe 2 years. So he tells a story that he used to work with iron, and he just found iron so fascinating, right? And he used to study iron, and he was just like so excited by iron and steel and that kind of thing. And then discovered that there's a verse in the Quran that explains how Allah sent down iron from the heavens, and so it's not an earthly element, right? And this just blew him away. This one single verse was enough to convince him. He found such closure, such a certainty in this tiny bit of information, one little thing. But why? He was actively seeking information about iron. He wanted to understand iron. He was looking for the truth about iron, and Islam provided that truth for him. And so we have to consider, what is it that we are seeking? What is it that we are open to? Are we in fact seeking anything, or are we just sitting back and going, yeah, nah, like I'm Muslim, and I believe in the Quran, and and then what happens is that the moment someone challenges us on our faith, we start to shake. Because, again, how firmly rooted are we in our faith? How firmly rooted are we in our spirituality? And the reason I'm mentioning this is because if we tie it back into step 2, is we've come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can return us to sanity. If we don't believe that, then, and we're just hoping for it, then are we even going to recognize it when it happens? So many of us falsely attribute what we have in our lives to our own efforts, as opposed to what we have in our life is really through Allah's mercy and Allah's ni'mah. What we earned yesterday or today or whatever was written and put out for us by Allah. That yes, our efforts may have been the vehicle, and it may have come through other people handing it to us, and again they've been the vehicle, but its origin is Allah, right? And so in this path of seeking this higher power, it's important for us to be open to it. So the author carries on and gives us a third formula. So the first was to look at Quran Hadith. The second is to look at nature externally as well as within ourselves. And the third is to behave according to what one believes, outwardly and inwardly, with zeal, like zealously, and to the limits of one's resources. That this brings about certainty is indicated by his saying, those who strive in us, to find us, we shall surely guide them to our way. And we've touched upon this before, right? That whoever moves to Allah a handspan, Allah moves to him an arm's length. And whoever comes to Allah walking, Allah goes to him running, right? So our efforts, and here's why it's not just about thinking that Allah might come to us or thinking that a higher power is there. That this third step here is about actioning the belief. So we may believe, yes, Allah exists and Allah is all-powerful and almighty and whatever, but are we acting in accordance with our belief? There's a lot of things that we believe. We might believe that sugar kills and that stress is harmful and that all sorts of things, but we'll still consume copious amounts of sugar, we'll still stress to the nth degree, we'll still do all sorts of things, even though it goes contrary to our belief. So the author here is saying one of the ways in which to establish certainty within our hearts is to act in accordance with our beliefs so that we can see the fruit thereof, right? And especially as it relates to the search for Allah and the search for spirituality and this movement towards the experiencing the reality that there's a higher power out there doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves and returning us to sanity, right? La ilaha illallah. Subhanallah. So to sum it up, certainty is an essential thing, and all other noble ranks, praiseworthy character traits and good works are really its branches and the result of it. The clearer we are in what we believe, the easier it is for us to act. If you think about a simple thing like, this is the month of charity, and we believe in what Allah promises us relative to charity, that Allah gives to us more, and that this is a special month, and that there are extra blessings for acts of charity and that kind of thing. And so you'll find that in this month, people are more charitable than any other month. Why? If we didn't believe that there was greater benefit to this month of Ramadan, then we wouldn't do it. If we're not making greater efforts in other months and only in this month, then we have to consider that our actions are based on our beliefs. And so the more we work to refine our belief and reestablish our belief and strengthen our belief, the more we'll notice that our actions will be in conformity to it, and that we'll reap fruit from it. Right? Sometimes we sort of become disillusioned with spirituality or prayer, because we think I make dua and I don't see the reality of that dua coming to fruition, right? And so the call to action is also as a way of establishing true hope. In sort of in Western thought, generally when you speak about hope, it's seen as a mental or emotional exercise, right? We must practice hope, and so you think about, kind of sort of like lighting a candle in your mind, so as to not go to just an especially dark place, not lose hope, to think that there is potentially a favorable outcome, ahead for us. But then in Islam, hope is defined differently. Hope is defined not just by attaching our desires to an outcome, but to take action towards those desires, which is incredible, because we speak about Islam and the nature of the believer, that he lives between hope and fear. And that hope, again, isn't simply a mental exercise, that it's one rooted in action. And if you think about all of what we've discussed relative to recovery is rooted in action. It's about picking up the phone, it's about sharing, it's about reaching out, it's about asking for help, it's about asking for nurturing, it's about doing the next best thing, right? It's about taking care of ourselves, even down to the simple thing like we mentioned, in terms of experiencing fun or serenity, that we might sit and enjoy a cup of tea outside, for instance. And here we start to again bring some of these concepts together, that if we're going to sit and enjoy a cup of tea, what better way to experience God's design? Generally we drink tea because it makes us feel a certain way, right? Black tea invigorates and rooibos calms, right? Again, for our international audience, rooibos, if you look it up, you'll see more like red bush, right? That's the English translation of it. It's a tea indigenous to South Africa, known to have like healing properties and that kind of thing. And so maybe you drink lavender tea to calm you, or chamomile tea to calm you, or whatever it is, right? But here we're drawing from nature, right? And if you're sitting outside, again, you're enjoying the experience of looking at nature and experiencing that calm and that kind of thing. And these are, again, with intention, all ways in which we can establish and grow our spirituality, right? And the certainty that there is in fact a higher power, and that the higher power is in fact returning us to serenity. If you think about the total insanity that was present in our lives in addiction, right? If you think about a simple thing like the difference between taking 5-10 minutes to enjoy a cup of tea versus the workaholic, or someone who's just constantly busy and in a state of chaos and flux all the time, there's this whole almost like coffee to go culture. We've got a million and one things to do. We have a phone in one hand, we grab a coffee and off we go. And so it's the coffee in our hand. We're not sitting down to sip the coffee, even enjoy the flavor. We just want the caffeine, and boom, off we go. And it's the next thing, and we're walking and we on our phones and we're sipping and we're not even paying attention. We're still on our phones, and there's just so much overwhelm. There's so little deliberation. There's so little intention. There's so little reflection, and so even just something as simple as sitting down and enjoying your tea, you can attribute and sort of ascribe it to some of the fruits of our spiritual practices, and you can see it as a return to serenity and a return to sanity. So again, for those of you who I just want to mention the book of Assistance by Imam Abdullah bin Alwi al-Haddad. It should be available at Timbuktu Books. There are copies online if you want to get that. A brilliant book, especially on this path and the road to recovery. So with that, we ask that Allah grant us understanding of the words of this great Imam, and an appreciation for his advices, that Allah gives us the ability to act on these advices immediately, and that He gives us the consistency to keep acting on it, and to act on it with intention, so that we experience the benefits of these advices, and that we come to know, not just believe, but to know without a shadow of a doubt that Allah is returning us to sanity, and Allah is doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. So with that, I bid you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, wa ahmadu da'wa